The first step with sewing your Sumekko dress is to sew the darts. I like to keep it quite simple when I'm sewing the darts, and I'll show you my way. I put a pin at the bottom and at the top of the dart. I then pinch the dart and fold the fabric in half along the length of the dart, and then I take another pin and I poke it through at the point, and then just have a check on the other side to see if it's in place. If it's a little bit out, I can just take the pin out, roll the fabric a smidge, mark it there, and it's marked correctly on the other side, and then I just push the pin through like so. Now my dart is ready to be sewn. I've got my stitch length at about 2.5, but this can vary a little bit between sewing machines. I'm working on a semi-industrial Bonina, but any machine is good. Now I'm ready to sew my dart. You may want to use a ballpoint needle or a jersey needle, but on my machine I just use the same type of size 12 needle for everything, or a size 10. So I'm going to start off by angling my fabric under the foot, taking the pin out. It's a good idea never to sew through over your pins, as it can blunt your needle. So I start off by sewing, back tacking, and then if you feel like it's a little bit sticky, you can hold the threads and give that a pull as you sew along the line that you have drawn. Keep a little bit of tension to keep your fold in place. Sew up to the middle of your dart, and rather than sewing into a point and pivoting, I like to just blend that curve around the dart. Sewing back down towards the other end, remove the pin and back tack. Some people prefer to tie off the ends on the end of the dart, and that's fine too. So there we have one dart sewn. Now you can sew the other 3 if you're using that many, or if you're using any at all. You may feel that you don't want to have any darts, which is fine. Okay, I've sewn my darts and I've pressed them away from the centre back seam, but feel free to press them in any direction that you like. Now I'm going to sew the centre back seam. So I've lined it all up and I've just used a few pins to keep everything in place. This pattern has a 1 centimetre seam allowance, so if I trim a little bit off with my overlocker, it guarantees that I have a nice straight edge, and also then is exactly 1 centimetre. I've got 4 threads on my overlocker and just a regular tension. Always be careful using pins in an overlocker, because you really don't want to sew through your pins. And that's the centre back seam done. Now we're going to sew the binding to the armholes. Take your binding and fold it so that the wrong sides are together and the right side is out. Line up your binding on the edge of your armhole, and I like to just start sewing a couple of centimetres to get started, and that helps hold everything in place while I can fiddle around with the rest of the garment. So it's tricky when you're sewing binding to different stretch fabrics, because they all have a different amount of stretch. Even with these ones, I've made one in green and one in orange, and the orange behaved differently to the green. So I like to just sort of give myself the flexibility of sewing the binding on and not pinning it into place first. So essentially the rule of thumb is that for every 10 centimetres you stretch at 1 centimetre, which is a 1% stretch, and you can see it's just a very gentle amount, and that helps create a curve so that the binding will roll in after you've sewn it. So try not to stretch the garment. You want to keep that flat, but just pulling your binding on top, just gently. So we're sewing around the armhole. At the bottom of the armhole, where the curve is steepest, I just want to pull it a little bit more, creating a bit more tension as I come under the arm. You may want to pin this in place first to test the amount of stretch that you have, but sometimes jerseys can roll and it can be quite tricky. So here I am, I've come off, and you can see I've got about 1.5 centimetres over with my stretch. So if I had a less stretchy jersey, it probably would have matched exactly. Now I'm going to do the other armhole. Okay, I've sewn both the armholes and I've pressed them so that the seam allowance is facing into the body of the dress. A little tip is to press from the shoulder down into the curve and then the shoulder down into the curve. That way you'll get a nice even shape. Next we're going to sew the right hand shoulder. So you could just overlock this if you wanted to, but what I like to do is just machine along the top to make sure that when it's finished I've got a nice intersection, because sometimes with the overlocker it can slip. So I'm just going to sew over that seam that I did on with my straight stitch, coming off the end. Now with this method of sewing the shoulders, rather than doing everything in a closed loop, it can sometimes get a bit messy with the overlocking. So what I like to do is just take those tails, thread them into a big darning needle and sew the tails back into the seam, like so. There are other methods of doing this, and if you go to Sue's Fashionista blog, she actually shows you a little trick that she does where she is able to get those tails sewn back in, well, all in one step with her overlocker. Next, I'm going to sew the neckline. So I take my neckline binding, fold it in half, wrong sides together, and place it on the right side of the dress. Now I'm going to just sew that on. I like to just do a few stitches to get it started so that then I've got both my hands free to sew the binding. And you can see I'm just stretching it slightly as I sew it. And that's going to create tension in the binding that will draw the neck in, because what we don't want is to have a gaping neck. So wherever you have more of a curve, so in the centre front or in the centre back, you want to create more tension, but you also want to do this over the shoulder seam. So I used a bit more tension sewing the neckline on, and as you can see, the binding has gone fitted end to end. Now I'm just going to give that a press. Okay, now we're going to sew the final shoulder. So once again, I've just straight stitched along that shoulder edge, and now I'm going to overlock. This time I want to have tails on both ends of my overlocking to thread through. So just give them a snip so they're nice and even. A darning needle is good because it has a large eye on it and it doesn't need to be sharp to thread through. So one side. And if you give it a little pull, it just helps draw that edge in. Snip the threads. And the other side. Thread the needle. Thread it back through the seam. And snip the threads. So I can give that shoulder a press and you can see the binding is matching beautifully. Now I'm just going to overlock the hem and do a 1 centimetre turn up. I could use my cover stitch machine or I could use twin needles on my straight sewing machine, but in this case I'm just going to use a single stitch with the straight stitch machine.
Why are you overlocking and using the cover stitch? Doesn't the
Yes.
cover stitch make the overlocking redundant?
It would, yes, so I'd either use the cover stitch machine or I would overlock and straight stitch.
Okay.
Yep. But I don't have a good colour match for my cover stitch machine and I find that it needs special threads. You can also leave the edges raw with jersey because it doesn't fray, and other options that you can do with the neckline are just to actually sew the shoulders and leave that raw and let it stretch out. And that will create a rolled edge, or you could just turn the edges under rather than doing a binding and using a cover stitch. And Sue's made a great little top which we will show in later on her blog, showing the variations that you can do with finishes for the neckline. And here's Sue in the finished dress and she just looks stunning. So this design that we printed on the front was Sue's own drawing that we traced in Illustrator and printed out. And it looks beautiful.